Every great European capital has a reason to exist. London has its river. Rome has its hills and its legions. Paris, Vienna, Lisbon, rivers, trade routes, harbours. Madrid has none of these advantages. No great navigable river, no port, no monumental Roman city beneath its centre. By the ordinary rules of geography, this city should not be here. And yet, from this dry plateau in the dead centre of Spain, an empire was governed that stretched from Manila to Mexico City, an empire on which, as its own subjects boasted, the sun never set. Madrid became a great capital for one overriding reason. In the year 1561, one king made one decision. Everything that followed, the golden age of Cervantes and Velázquez, the uprising against Napoleon, a siege that lasted 28 months, and a night in the 1980s when the whole city seemed to wake up at once. All of it grew from that single choice. This is the story of the capital built from almost nothing, and why nothing could ever bring it down. Chapter 1. The Fortress That Wasn't Meant to Be a City. To understand how strange Madrid's story is, you have to start with what it was built for, because Madrid was not built to be a city. It was built as one link in a chain of frontier defences guarding the approaches to another city entirely. In the middle of the 9th century, most of what we now call Spain was not Christian, and it was not called Spain. It was Al-Andalus, a Muslim land ruled from the southern city of Córdoba, and by the 800s, Córdoba had grown into one of the most sophisticated cities in Europe. Later accounts celebrated its paved streets, its water systems, its libraries, and its nighttime illumination, at a time when most towns north of the Pyrenees were clusters of wood and mud. Its rulers, the Umayyad emirs, governed most of the Iberian Peninsula and answered to no one. But every realm has a nervous frontier. For Córdoba, that frontier was the north, where small Christian kingdoms were pushing down from the mountains, raiding deeper with each generation, and the road those raiders wanted led to Toledo, the great fortress city on the Tagus River, the key to the entire centre of the peninsula. So sometime around the year 865, and historians debate the exact date because no founding document survives, the Emir Muhammad, the first of Córdoba, ordered a line of watchtowers and strongholds built along that frontier. One of them rose on a steep bluff above a small river called the Manzanares. The Arabic chroniclers would come to call the place Mayrit. Notice what that means. One of the most powerful rulers in the Western Mediterranean looked at this exact spot, the spot where the royal palace of Madrid stands today, and saw nothing worth having in itself. He saw a good place to watch the horizon. Madrid began its life the way a security camera begins its life. It existed so that something more important, somewhere else, could feel safe. And yet the site was chosen with real intelligence. The bluff was high and easy to defend, with clear sightlines across the river valley. Smaller watchtowers stood along the ridges nearby, and they may well have allowed warnings to travel across the plateau by fire or smoke, faster than any horse could carry them. The ground itself held a secret too. Beneath the dry surface ran layers of soil that trapped groundwater, and the settlers dug wells and underground channels to reach it. Some scholars, including the Spanish Arabist Jaime Oliver Assin, have argued that the very name Mayrit comes from an Arabic root referring to channels of flowing water, though other researchers have questioned parts of that reading, so hold it as likely rather than proven. A later local saying remembered the town in a single line: "I was built on water. My walls are made of fire." The water was the hidden springs. The fire, by the traditional explanation, was the flint in the walls, stone that sparked when struck. Whether or not the saying is as old as it claims, the pride in it is real. This was a town that knew what it was standing on. So what was daily life actually like here? Strip away everything you know about Madrid and picture it. A walled military compound covering a few hectares. Inside, the soldiers of the frontier garrison and their families. A small mosque. Storehouses of grain against siege or drought. Below the walls, farmers worked garden plots along the riverbank, and shepherds moved flocks across the plain. There was a market, because even a fortress must eat and trade. There were craftsmen working leather and iron for the garrison. In summer the heat pressed down like a hand, and the river shrank to a thread. In winter the wind came off the Guadarrama mountains with snow on its breath. Castilians would later describe their plateau with a hard little saying, 9 months of winter and 3 months of hell. The people of Madrid lived their whole lives inside that saying, watching the north, and they were watching for something specific, not armies of conquest, at first, but raids, a column of horsemen appearing on the ridge, burning what stood outside the walls, driving off livestock, and vanishing before help could arrive. That was the rhythm of the frontier for generations, a later Arabic geographical tradition, preserved in the work of al-Himyari, remembered Madrid as a small but solid fortress town, notable for its walls, not for its markets, not for its scholars, for its walls. Those walls were tested. In the year 932, the Christian king Ramiro II of Leon came down from the north and attacked Madrid. The chronicles of his reign say his forces broke through the defences and burned what they could before withdrawing. Sit with that detail for a moment. Even Madrid's enemies, having beaten it, did not want to keep it. The fortress was repaired, the garrison returned, and the watching went on for another century and a half. Here is the point to carry forward, because it is the foundation stone of this entire story. Almost every great city on earth is born from an advantage. A harbour, a river crossing, a mine, a crossroads. Madrid is one of the very few born from a danger. It existed because this stretch of frontier was contested, and the moment the frontier moved, the town's entire reason for being would vanish with it. History is full of frontier forts that faded into names in old documents and low mounds in empty fields. By every reasonable prediction, that should have been Madrid's fate. And at the end of the 11th century, the moment arrived, because the frontier did not simply move, it collapsed. In the year 1085, the Christian king Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile achieved what generations before him had failed to do. He took Toledo itself, the very city Madrid had been built to shield. The little watchtower town woke up inside a different world, a Christian world, stripped of its purpose, with no way of knowing that its true story had not even begun. Chapter 2. Changing Hands. Staying Small. Madrid did not fall in a famous battle. Sometime around the year 1083, most likely during the campaigns that would culminate in the capture of Toledo 2 years later, the fortress of Madrid passed into the hands of Alfonso VI. No surviving chronicle records a siege or a celebrated fight for the town, which suggests surrender or quiet absorption as the Christian advance rolled past. Madrid changed civilizations the way a house changes owners. With the furniture still in place, many of the Muslim inhabitants stayed, for generations afterward. Christian Madrid had its Moorish quarter, the Moraria, whose crooked street pattern you can still walk today in the oldest corner of the city. Mudéjar craftsmen, Muslims living and working under Christian rule, shaped much of the town's early building, and the brick tower of San Nicolas is commonly associated with that inheritance, although its precise dating has been debated by architectural historians. The town also acquired its own founding legend in these years. The story tells of a hidden image of the Virgin Mary, walled up for safekeeping centuries earlier, discovered inside the old ramparts. She became the Virgin of the Almudena, patroness of the city, her name echoing the Arabic word for the citadel wall. Historians treat the tale as pious tradition rather than documented event, but the legend itself is telling. Madrid's own origin story is about something precious hidden inside a defensive wall. Even its miracles were military. Now let us be honest about what Madrid actually was for the next 500 years, because this is the part most tellings rush past. And the emptiness is exactly the point. Madrid was a minor town in a kingdom full of major ones. In the year 1202, King Alfonso VIII granted the town its fuero, a charter of laws and privileges. That document is worth a moment, because it shows us the place in close-up. It regulates grazing rights and the use of common woodland. It fixes penalties for theft and for injury. It concerns itself with vineyards, ovens, mills, and the movement of livestock. This is the legal portrait of a farming and herding town of a few thousand souls, organizing its fields and its quarrels, not a portrait of ambition. Over the following centuries, the royal Cortes, the assembly of the kingdom, met in Madrid on a handful of occasions. Kings passed through, and that is roughly the whole resume. While Madrid was filing paperwork, its neighbours were making history. Think of Castile in these centuries as a company with several star employees. Toledo was the ancient capital and the seat of the archbishop, the spiritual head of all Spain, a city where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish learning had mingled for generations. Sevilla, after its conquest in 1248, became the gateway to the south, and later held the legal monopoly on trade with the Americas, which made it one of the richest cities on earth. Valladolid was the favoured northern seat of the royal court, a city of jurists and administrators. Burgos had the wool trade that linked Castile to the looms of Flanders. Salamanca had one of Europe's oldest universities, and Madrid had rabbits. This is only half a joke. The town's greatest attraction for royalty was its wilderness. The oak forests of El Pardo, just north of town, were thick with boar and deer, and in the 1400s, King Enrique III built a hunting lodge there. Madrid's role in the kingdom was to be pleasant, discreet, and unimportant, a place where power came to relax, never where power lived. Even Madrid's beloved patron saint fits this humble profile. Isidro, a farm labourer who worked the fields outside the walls in the 1100s, became famous not for leading armies or founding cathedrals, but for ploughing, praying, and finding water. Centuries later, the church declared him a saint, and to this day he is the patron of Madrid, honoured every May with a festival that takes over the city. Other cities chose warrior saints and royal saints. Madrid's holiest figure is a man with a plough. There may be no better summary of the town's first 5 centuries. By the early 1500s, Madrid held somewhere between 10 and 20,000 inhabitants, and I flag that population figures from this era are estimates drawn from tax and parish records. It was a decent market town with good water, several monasteries, and a royal castle, the old Alcazar, rebuilt and enlarged on the site of the original Muslim fortress. It had no cathedral, no university, no port, and no claim to greatness of any kind. Now step back and look at the chessboard, because this is where the story turns strange. By the mid-1500s, quote, the Spanish monarchy had become the dominant dynastic power in Europe, with an American empire of staggering size behind it, and silver beginning to flow from the mines of Potosi. And this vast enterprise had no fixed capital at all. The court was medieval in its habits. It travelled, hundreds of officials, secretarias, cooks, and courtiers packed the government into wagons and moved from city to city, following the king. Archives were carried in chests. Ambassadors chased the monarch across Castile to deliver their letters. Every serious city in the kingdom assumed that when the music stopped, the crown would settle in one of them. Toledo had the history and the church. Valladolid had the institutions. Sevilla had the money. Each was a strong candidate, precisely because each was strong. And that, if you have been paying attention, was exactly the problem. A king who moves into a strong city becomes that city's guest. A king who moves into a weak one becomes its master. In the spring of 1561, a quiet order went out from the most powerful court in Europe. To understand it, we need to meet the man who gave it. He may be the most misunderstood ruler of his age. Chapter 3. One Man's Decision. Philip II of Spain has a public image problem that is now 4.5 centuries old. His enemies called him the Spider of the Escorial, a gloomy fanatic in black, weaving plots from behind a desk. His admirers called him the most prudent king in Christendom. Both sides agree on one thing. He was a man who governed with paper, where his father, the Emperor Carlos V, had ruled from horseback, crossing Europe again and again to lead armies in person. Philip ruled from a chair. He read reports, annotated them in the margins, and sent them back. He has been called the first great bureaucrat king, and his empire almost had to be governed that way, as information, because no ruler could physically visit territories scattered from the Americas to the Philippines, islands that carry his name to this day. Hold that picture in your mind, a king who ruled through documents, because it explains what happened in the spring of 1561. That spring, Philip ordered his court to move from Toledo to Madrid, and here is the detail that historians have puzzled over ever since. He never explained why. No decree survives announcing Madrid as the capital. No letter lays out the reasoning. The government simply packed and moved, and one of the most consequential decisions in Spanish history happened almost silently, like a man rearranging his own furniture. Because the king stayed silent, we are left with theories, and honesty requires us to label them as theories. Here are the 4 strongest, roughly in the order historians tend to weigh them. The first is geography. Madrid sits almost exactly at the center of the Iberian Peninsula. For a king who governed by courier, a capital at the center meant that orders and reports reached every corner of the realm in the most balanced way possible. The royal chronicler Luis Cabrera de Córdoba, writing a generation later, praised exactly this central position, a capital at the heart of the body, so that decisions could flow outward like blood. The second is water and health. The Toledo of the 1500s was cramped, built on a rock above a gorge, with narrow streets and little room to grow. Madrid had space, air that contemporaries praised as healthful, forests for hunting, and that famous groundwater we met in Chapter 1. Some historians add that the young queen, Isabel de Valois, found Toledo oppressive, though how much her comfort weighed in the decision is genuinely uncertain. So hold that detail loosely. The third theory is the most political, and to my mind the most interesting. Toledo was not just a city, it was the seat of the Archbishop of Toledo, the richest and most powerful churchman in Spain, and a proud city with its own institutions and its own recent history of defiance. Because Toledo had been a centre of the Comunero uprising against Philip's father in the 1520s, a king who settled there would forever share the stage. Madrid had no archbishop and no rival ecclesiastical or aristocratic establishment comparable to those of Toledo or Valladolid. Biographers of Philip, including Manuel Fernández Álvarez, have pointed to precisely this absence as one of Madrid's chief qualifications. On this reading, the town brought nothing to the marriage, and that was its dowry. The fourth theory is the simplest. Perhaps Philip never intended to found an eternal capital at all. Perhaps he was choosing a convenient seat for the court, while his true passion, the palace monastery of El Escorial, rose in the mountains nearby. On this reading, Madrid became permanent the way many temporary arrangements do, by lasting just long enough that moving became unthinkable. The truth is probably a braid of all four, and we will never have the king's own words to settle it. But notice what kind of decision this was. Rome was not decided. London was not decided. Those cities accumulated, century by century, through trade and geography and luck. Madrid was appointed, promoted to the post by an order no one has ever found in writing. The closest cousin in later history is Washington, a capital placed by political calculation on ground chosen for balance rather than commerce. Spain simply did it 2.25 centuries earlier. The effects were immediate and chaotic. The court arrived, and behind the court came everyone who feeds on a court, nobles who needed to be near the king, and servants who fed the nobles, and lawyers, tailors, bakers, builders, beggars, and ambassadors. The best estimates suggest Madrid held under 20,000 people when the court arrived. Within a few decades it was approaching 100,000, which made it one of the fastest growing cities in Europe, and it grew without a port, without a navigable river, without any industry except one: government. Madrid manufactured decisions, and the entire Spanish world consumed them. The town could not cope, and the crown knew it. A royal regulation known as the Regalia de Aposento required householders to give up part of their homes to lodge officials of the court. The response of the people of Madrid tells you everything about how ordinary Spaniards greet royal decrees. All over town, owners built houses deliberately awkward, single-story homes. Homes with hidden upper floors concealed behind low facades. Buildings designed to look too small to billet a bureaucrat. They were called houses of malice, casas a la malicia, and a few survive in the old centre today. The capital of a world empire was being built, from day one, as a negotiation between power and stubbornness. Keep that trait in mind. It returns in this story with muskets, and later with barricades. There was one more test of the decision, and it came a generation later. After Philip died, his son Philip III was persuaded by his favourite minister, the Duke of Lerma, to move the court to Valladolid in 1601. Historians have long noted that Lerma had bought property in Valladolid beforehand and profited handsomely, which may make this the most expensive real estate manoeuvre in Spanish history. Madrid emptied and nearly collapsed. Rents fell. Shops closed. Then, after only 5 years, the experiment failed, and in 1606 the court came back for good. A city born from one decision had survived its first attempted repeal. The saying that grew up afterward captured the new reality in 4 words. Only Madrid is caught. The appointment was now permanent. The blank page had been written on. What no one yet knew was what would be written next. In a city where the streets were still mud and the money of 2 hemispheres was about to arrive. Chapter 4. Capital of an empire the sun never left. Let us begin with a single object, because sometimes one object explains a century better than 1,000 dates. The object is a coin, a piece of 8, a silver dollar of the Spanish Empire. It was minted from silver dug out of a mountain in Potosi, in what is now Bolivia, a mountain so rich that its name became a Spanish expression for limitless wealth. That coin crossed the Atlantic in a treasure fleet, was counted in Sevilla, and was spent in Madrid, and from Madrid. Coins exactly like it flowed out to pay armies in the Netherlands, bankers in Genoa, and merchants whose silks came from China through Manila. The piece of 8 is often described as the first truly global currency, accepted from Boston to Beijing. One more detail is worth keeping. When the young United States created its own money, the dollar was modelled on that Spanish coin, and Spanish dollars remained legal tender in America until the 1850s. The dollar in a modern wallet is a distant descendant of the money that passed through Madrid. Now hold that shining coin in one hand, and in the other hand hold this. The city all that silver flowed through had streets of mud, no sewer system worth the name, and a nightly ritual that visitors never forgot, in which household waste was flung from windows to the street below with a shouted warning. Ambassadors from Italy and France, who came from cities of marble and fountains, wrote home in genuine disbelief. This was the capital of the world. This overgrown village where pigs rooted through the lanes behind the royal palace. This is the great paradox of Habsburg Madrid, and I want you to see it as a diagnosis, not a joke. Spain's monarchy had become what many historians describe as the first empire to govern substantial territories across several continents and oceans at once. Yet its capital produced nothing except power. There were no guilds of weavers slowly building wealth across generations. No merchant dynasties investing in docks and warehouses. There was the court, and everything else was scaffolding around the court. Money arrived in great pulses when the treasure fleets landed, and it left just as fast, to creditors abroad. The historian Fernand Braudel described the Spain of this era as a channel through which American silver flowed on its way to the rest of Europe, enriching everyone except, in the end, Spain itself. Madrid was the narrowest point of that channel. Wealth touched the city constantly and settled in it rarely. You could see the imbalance in the population itself. What a strange 100,000 people it was. An enormous share were servants, clergy, soldiers between wars, office seekers, and the poor who followed them all. Contemporary satirists joked that half of Madrid was employed in waiting for a post, waiting for a pension, waiting for an audience. The city's true industry was hope. Now let me show you how the machinery actually worked, because it is easy to say world empire and hard to picture it. Imagine a report written by the Viceroy of Peru. It is carried by mule from Lima to the coast, waits for the fleet, crosses to Panama, goes overland, crosses the Atlantic under naval escort, and is unloaded at Sevilla. Then it travels by road to Madrid, where a clerk of the Council of the Indies logs its arrival. It is summarized, debated by councillors, and eventually placed on the king's desk with a recommendation. Philip reads it, writes in the margin, and the answer begins the same journey in reverse. 2 years might pass between question and reply. Now multiply that by the Netherlands, by Sicily, by Naples, by Mexico, by the Philippines, all arriving at once, all urgent, all landing on the same few streets. The councils of the empire met within a short walk of one another. Clerks copied by hand. Secretaries wrote through the night. What was happening in Madrid was one of history's earliest attempts to administer a genuinely global realm from a single court. And the strain of that experiment showed in every overloaded office. Governments have collapsed under less, and out of this chaos, the appointed capital began, slowly, to look like one. The instrument of that transformation was a square. In 1617, under Philip III, work began to rebuild the old market square into something no Spanish city had seen. A single, unified, monumental plaza, designed by the architect Juan Gómez de Mora and completed around 1619. That square is the ancestor of the Plaza Mayor on our thumbnail, though not quite its twin, because fire came for it 3 times over the following centuries. After the last and worst blaze in 1790, the architect Juan de Villanueva rebuilt it into the enclosed rectangle of red brick and slate spires we see today. The Madrid of the Habsburgs designed this stage. The Madrid of a later age rebuilt it after burning it down, which is a habit this city will show us again. I use the word stage deliberately, because that is what it was built to be. Royal proclamations were read there. Bullfights were held there. The king watching from a balcony. Canonization ceremonies filled it with incense and choirs, and the tribunals of the Inquisition held their great public ceremonies of penance there. The autos de fe, spectacles of accusation and punishment that could draw enormous crowds. The square hosted glory and cruelty with the same architecture, and both deserve to be said plainly. Stand in the Plaza Mayor today with a coffee, and you stand where an empire displayed itself at its most magnificent and at its most merciless. For the ordinary Madrileno, though, the empire was mostly weather. It rained offices or it rained hunger, and you could not control which. And here is the thought to carry out of this chapter. A city built on trade learns patience, bookkeeping, and compromise. A city built on power learns ceremony, connection, and the art of being seen at the right window. Madrid learned to perform. It became a city where display outran substance, where a nobleman might starve his household to gild his carriage. The satirists of the age made entire careers out of that single observation. And that is the final paradox, the most beautiful one. This indebted, muddy, improvised capital, this city of pretenders and paupers, was about to produce, within a single generation, some of the greatest literature and painting the world has ever known. Chapter 5. The Golden Age on Dirty Streets. In the first years of the 1600s, on a modest street in Madrid, in a neighbourhood of printers and taverns, lived a man in his late 50s whose life had been, by any worldly measure, a failure. He had been a soldier and lost the use of his left hand in battle. He had been seized by corsairs and held captive in Algiers for 5 years. While his family struggled to raise a ransom, he had worked as a tax collector and been jailed over irregular accounts. And in 1605, this man published a book about an aging gentleman who reads too many stories of knights, loses his grip on where fiction ends, and rides out to live inside his fantasy. The man was Miguel de Cervantes. The book was Don Quixote. It is widely described as the first modern novel, and it remains, 4 centuries later, among the most published books in human history. Here is the detail that should stop you. Cervantes wrote the second part of Don Quixote while living on a street that today bears his name, and on that same short street stood the house of Lope de Vega, the most famous playwright alive. A man so productive that his own claim of having written some 1,500 plays is still debated by scholars, with several hundred surviving. The two men were neighbours. They were also rivals, and the published barbs they aimed at each other over the years leave little doubt that the rivalry ran hot. A few streets away lived Francisco de Quevedo, the sharpest satirist in the Spanish language. A famous story, probably polished in the retelling, claims that Quevedo bought the very house where his literary archenemy, the Put Luis de Góngora, was living, and put him out on the street. Whatever the exact truth of the house, the feud itself was gloriously real, conducted in verses that Spanish schoolchildren still read. The neighbourhood where all this happened is still there. It is called the Barrio de las Letras, the Quarter of Letters, and its pavements are inlaid today with bronze quotations underfoot. Within this 1 square kilometre, in one lifetime, lived Cervantes, Lope de Vega, Quevedo, Góngora, and the playwright Calderón de la Barca. To match that concentration of literary firepower on adjacent streets, you would need Elizabethan London around Shakespeare's Globe, and the comparison is not casual, because the two golden stages rose together and closed a chapter together. Cervantes and Shakespeare both died in April of 1616, though England and Spain were using different calendars at the time, so the two deaths fell about 10 days apart rather than on the same day. The coincidence was still neat enough that the date was later chosen to mark World Book Day. Why did it happen here? Why did a muddy, indebted capital become a literary supernova? Historians still argue, but the outlines are visible, and the theatres are the best place to see them. Madrid's playhouses were called corrals, and they were not purpose-built palaces of culture. They were open courtyards wedged between apartment blocks, with the stage at one end and the sky overhead. Nobles rented the balconies of the surrounding houses. Commoners stood in the pit, packed shoulder to shoulder, and they were merciless, capable of shouting a play off the stage inside 10 minutes. Women watched from a separate gallery known as the stewpot. Vendors sold water and fruit through the crowd. That mixed, noisy, demanding public forced playwrights to deliver high poetry and low comedy in the same afternoon, and to hook an audience in the opening scene or lose it. It was commercial theatre in the purest sense, and the competition made the writing sharper year by year. Meanwhile, the city itself supplied endless material. A capital of pretenders and office seekers is a satirist's paradise. The Golden Age did not bloom in spite of Madrid's chaos. It fed on it. Then, in 1623, the other half of the miracle arrived. A 24-year-old painter from Sevilla came to court, was granted a sitting with the young King Philip IV, and painted a portrait so commanding that he was named royal painter almost at once. His name was Diego Velázquez, and for the next 37 years he painted the Spanish court from inside. Kings and princesses, jesters and dwarfs, gods and drunkards, ending with Las Meninas. The vast canvas of 1656 that art historians have called the theology of painting, a picture that seems to watch you back. It hangs today in the Prado, a few minutes' walk from the streets where the poets duelled. Now step back, because the timing of all this beauty is the true subject of the chapter. The very decades in which Cervantes published Quixote and Velázquez painted his masterpieces were the decades in which Spanish power visibly began to fail. The treasure fleets no longer covered the debts, and the crown suspended payments to its bankers repeatedly across this era. Plague swept Castile at the turn of the century, killing on a scale historians measure in the hundreds of thousands. In 1640, Catalonia and Portugal rose in revolt in the same year. In 1643, at Rocroi, the celebrated army of Flanders suffered a defeat that later generations turned into a symbol of Spain's fading military supremacy. The long sunset had begun, and everyone at court could feel the light changing. So the Golden Age was not the art of a confident empire. It was the art of an empire watching itself decline, and knowing it. That is why Don Quixote, for all its comedy, aches. It is a book about the gap between the glorious story a man tells himself and the shabby world he actually rides through. Written in a country living exactly that gap, Quevedo dropped the comedy altogether in a famous sonnet, writing that he looked upon the walls of his homeland and found them crumbling. Velázquez painted the royal family with unblinking honesty. Fragile people in magnificent clothes. The art told the truth that the official pageantry could not. Here is the thought to sit with before we move on. Nations tend to assume their culture will peak when their power does. Madrid suggests the opposite can happen. The silver ran out. The armies lost. The empire shrank until, centuries later, it was gone entirely. And the books and paintings made in those failing years are now worth more to humanity than all the silver of Potosi. Power buys the stage. It does not write the play. In the palace, meanwhile, the dynasty itself was running out of something no treasure fleet could replace: heirs. Chapter 6. A New Dynasty. A New Face. Dynasties do not usually die of natural causes. They are overthrown, or they are conquered. The Spanish Habsburgs managed something rarer. They married themselves out of existence. For nearly 2 centuries, the family had wed within itself to keep its empire undivided. Uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins, generation after generation. Each marriage made perfect political sense on its own, and together they were a slow catastrophe. A modern genetic study by researchers at the University of Santiago de Compostela estimated that the last Spanish Habsburg carried an inbreeding coefficient slightly higher than the theoretical average for the child of a brother and sister. That last Habsburg was King Carlos II, and his life was a long medical tragedy. He walked late, spoke late, and was chronically ill for most of his years. He could not father children. He was known even in his own time as Carlos the Bewitched, because his court could find no better explanation for his condition than sorcery, and exorcisms were performed on a reigning king of Spain. In the year 1700, he died in the Alcazar of Madrid at 38 years old, and with him died the male line that had ruled Spain for 184 years. He left behind a will, and that will detonated a world war. Carlos named as his heir a French prince, Philip of Anjou, grandson of King Louis XIV of France. To the rest of Europe, this was a nightmare scenario. The crowns of France and Spain drifting toward a single family and a single strategic bloc. England, Austria, the Netherlands, and their allies went to war to prevent it, backing a rival Austrian candidate. The War of the Spanish Succession lasted from 1701 to 1714 and was fought from the plains of Flanders to the Caribbean. In the English colonies of North America, the same conflict unfolded under the name Queen Anne's War. with raids burning along the New England frontier. A dispute that began at a deathbed in Madrid reached the villages of Massachusetts. Spain itself split. Castile, with Madrid at its heart, largely stood by the French prince, now Philip V. Much of the crown of Aragon, including Catalonia, backed the Austrian. Madrid was occupied twice by Allied armies and twice returned, and the sight of foreign soldiers in the Plaza Mayor left a mark on the city's memory. When the fighting ended, Philip V kept his throne at a price. Spain surrendered its European territories in Italy and the Netherlands, and Britain kept Gibraltar, which it holds to this day, a fact that still surfaces in Spanish politics 3 centuries later. Inside Spain, the new dynasty, the Bourbons, changed the very idea of what a king was. The Habsburgs had governed through councils, ceremony, and consultation. The Bourbons imported the French model, centralized and administrative, obsessed with uniformity. The old kingdoms of Aragon lost their separate institutions. Government by committee gave way to government by minister. And a state like that wanted a capital that looked like the state, rather than a sprawl of brick and mud around a medieval castle. Which brings us to Christmas Eve of 1734. That night, fire broke out in the old Alcazar of Madrid, the palace that had grown out of the original Muslim fortress. Layer upon layer, across 8 centuries, the blaze burned for days. Because it was a holiday night, the response was slow and confused. Courtiers threw paintings from the windows into the snow to save them, and much was saved that way. But the losses were terrible. Art historians count hundreds of works destroyed. Among them paintings by Velázquez, known today only from copies and inventories. Think about what burned. Everything Madrid had physically been. The watchtower foundations, the medieval castle, the rooms where Philip II had made his silent decision. All of it went down to the stone in a single week. The response tells you everything about the new dynasty. Philip V ordered a palace that could not burn, built of stone and brick with barely a stick of structural timber, and he ordered it on the exact same bluff above the Manzanares. The Italian architects, Filippo Juvara and then Giovanni Battista Sacchetti, designed a colossus in the Roman manner, and construction ran from 1738 to 1751, with decoration continuing long after. Philip V never lived in it. His successors moved in from 1764 onward. That building is the Palacio Real on our thumbnail. It is commonly described as the largest royal palace in Western Europe by floor area, with well over 3,000 rooms, though today it serves mainly for state ceremonies rather than as the royal family's everyday home. Pause on the symbolism, because it is almost too perfect. Madrid's oldest site began as a fortress raised by one dynasty of foreign origin, and it was rebuilt as a palace by another. That ground has never once belonged to Madrid itself. It has always belonged to whoever ruled Spain. Such is the fate of an appointed capital. Its heart is a government building, yet something quieter was stirring in these same decades, and it would matter more in the long run than the marble. The new administrative monarchy needed people who could write, calculate, survey, and argue on paper. It needed clerks, engineers, and academies. The Royal Spanish Academy of Language was founded in 1713 with a motto about cleaning, fixing, and giving splendour to the Spanish tongue. The Royal Academy of History followed in 1738. Printing houses multiplied. A city of courtiers was slowly acquiring a city of professionals, men who owed their position to competence rather than blood. That is a quiet revolution, and it has a predictable consequence. professionals, given time, develop opinions. All of it now waited on one thing: a ruler who would treat the city itself as his project. In 1759, that ruler arrived from Naples. Chapter 7. The best mayor Madrid ever had was a king. Carlos III was 53 years old when he became King of Spain in 1759, and he arrived with an unusual resume. He had already been a king for 25 years, ruling Naples and Sicily, where he had built palaces, founded industries, and sponsored the excavations, then uncovering the buried Roman cities of Herculaneum and Pompeii. He was that rarest of rulers, an experienced one. He had made his mistakes on somebody else's capital. The Madrid he inherited held roughly 150,000 people, and by the accounts of travellers, it remained one of the dirtiest major cities in Europe. The old habits had never been cured. Waste in the streets, mud to the ankles, darkness after sundown, and a smell that foreign visitors mentioned before they mentioned anything else. A remark attributed to Carlos, and I flag it as anecdote rather than document, compared the people of Madrid to children who cry when they are washed. Whether or not he said it, he governed as if he believed it. What followed was the most concentrated program of urban reform in the city's history. Streets were paved by the thousands of meters and fitted with drainage, so that waste ran somewhere other than past your door. Oil lamps went up on a scale contemporaries found remarkable, and with them came a night watch to light and guard them. Garbage collection was organized on a schedule. Trees were planted. The dusty promenade along the city's eastern edge became the Paseo del Prado, an elegant avenue with fountains shaped by the architect Ventura Rodriguez within a design plan by José de Hermosilla. Among them rose the fountain of Cybele, the goddess in her lion-drawn chariot, a monument that today doubles as the place where Real Madrid celebrates its championships. At the city's eastern gate rose a triumphal arch of granite, the Puerta de Alcalá, designed by Francesco Sabatini and finished in 1778, older than the Arc de Triomphe in Paris and the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. A fact Madrileños enjoy mentioning. Carlos also planted institutions, and one of them became the city's crown jewel by accident. He commissioned a grand neoclassical building on the Prado to house a cabinet of natural sciences, designed by the architect Juan de Villanueva, the same man who would later rebuild the Plaza Mayor after its fire. Carlos never saw his building's final use. Decades later, it opened instead as the Prado Museum, and the Royal Art Collection moved in. Velázquez, Goya, Titian, Bosch. The hunting kings of the 1500s had accidentally assembled one of the greatest art collections on earth, and the reforming king of the 1700s had accidentally built its home. History rarely plans its best gifts, but this chapter is not a portrait of a perfect king, because the most instructive thing Carlos did was fail, publicly and dangerously, in his 7th year on the throne, and the failure began, of all places, with clothing. Carlos had brought with him an Italian minister, the Marquis of Esquilache, energetic, foreign, and reformist, in 1766, with bread prices already painful after poor harvests and the loosening of the grain trade. Esquilache enforced a decree attacking the traditional dress of Madrid, the long cape and the broad-brimmed hat, on the theory that the costume let criminals hide their faces and their weapons. Constables stopped men in the streets and trimmed their capes on the spot. The government of a world power had decided to police what the poor of Madrid wore. Madrid answered on Palm Sunday of 1766. Crowds rose across the city. thousands strong, shouting for the fall of Esquilache. The new lamps were smashed as symbols of the hated ministry. The rioters reached the royal palace itself, and the King of Spain was forced to appear on a balcony and concede, then quietly left his own capital for the palace of Aranjuez. For a time, Madrid belonged to the crowd. Historians who have studied the Esquilache riots, John Lynch among them, point beyond the hats to the deeper fuel: bread prices, resentment of foreign ministers, and the fury of a people being improved without being consulted. The clothing decree was withdrawn, and Esquilache was dismissed and sent abroad. Now notice what Carlos did next, because this is why the chapter carries his name. In effect, he did not abandon reform. He changed its political method. The lighting, the paving, the drains, the avenues, all of it continued, but under Spanish ministers, at a negotiated pace, with bread supplies watched carefully. The capes and hats stayed, and within a generation that same traditional dress was being celebrated in the paintings of Goya as the very identity of Madrid. The king had learned the lesson this city teaches every ruler who will listen. Madrid will accept change. It will not accept contempt. There is a straight line, and I want you to see it, from the Casas a la Malicia of chapter 3. Those houses built cunningly small to dodge the royal billeting officers, to the smashed lamps of 1766. Madrid's official history is written by kings. Its character is written in these acts of stubbornness. Carlos III died in 1788, mourned as few Spanish kings have ever been. Even today, ask historians to name the best ruler Madrid ever had, and his name comes up so often that the old compliment has hardened into a cliché. The best mayor Madrid ever had. The city he polished seemed poised for a serene new century, with its lamps lit and its avenues planted and its museum rising on the Prado. What it got instead, within 20 years of his death, was occupation by a foreign empire, and its darkest and bravest single day. That day has a date for a name, the 2nd of May. Chapter 8. The 2nd of May. There is a room in the Prado Museum where two large paintings hang near each other, and together they contain this entire chapter. In the first, a chaotic street fight boils around men on horseback, knives against sabres, faces twisted at close range. In the second, it is night, and a man in a white shirt kneels before a firing squad, his arms thrown wide, a lantern lighting him like a stage. The painter was Francisco de Goya. The paintings are known as the 2nd of May and the 3rd of May, and the story of how those 2 days happened is the story of how Napoleon Bonaparte made one of the greatest miscalculations of his career on the streets of Madrid. To get there, we have to watch Spain's government rot in real time. By 1808, the crown that Carlos III had worn with such competence sat on his son, Carlos IV, a king of limited energy whose government was dominated by the royal favourite Manuel Godoy. Godoy was a former guardsman who had risen astonishingly fast to run the country, and he was hated for it at every level of society. Resented by the nobility as an upstart, and blamed by the poor for the price of bread. Spain had drifted into the orbit of Napoleonic France, and Spanish sailors had already paid for that alignment, dying alongside the French at the naval catastrophe of Trafalgar in 1805. Then, in the spring of 1808, the royal family tore itself apart in public. A palace uprising at Aranjuez, engineered by supporters of the heir, forced Godoy from power and pushed Carlos IV to abdicate in favor of his son Fernando. The young man rode into Madrid to cheering crowds who believed, with no evidence whatsoever, that he would be their salvation. Napoleon watched this family feud and saw an open door. He summoned both the old king and the new one to the French city of Bayonne. There, in a maneuver of breathtaking cynicism, he pressured both to renounce the throne, which he then handed to his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte. Spain, an allied kingdom that had never been conquered, discovered that it had been quietly annexed at a conference table, and French troops, who had entered the country as friends marching toward Portugal, were already garrisoned in Madrid under Marshal Joachim Murat. The people of Madrid understood what their elites pretended not to. Through late April the city simmered. Crowds gathered when French soldiers moved through the streets. Rumours ran from parish to parish that the last members of the royal family were about to be taken north as well. On the morning of the 2nd of May, 1808, that rumour came true in front of witnesses. Outside the royal palace, carriages were being prepared to carry away the remaining royals. Among them a young prince. A crowd gathered. Someone shouted that they were taking the boy. The crowd surged toward the carriages. French troops fired, and the city that had risen over capes and hats 42 years earlier rose again, this time against one of the finest armies in the world. What followed was not a battle. It was a city fighting with what a city has. Locksmiths, carpenters, water carriers, and the women of the markets. They attacked cavalry with kitchen knives, with awls and scissors, with flower pots and roof tiles hurled from balconies. Among the dead that day was a 15-year-old seamstress named Manuela Malassana, whose name a whole Madrid neighborhood carries today. The traditional story holds that she was executed because the sewing scissors she carried were counted as a weapon. Historians treat that particular detail as tradition rather than proven fact, but the essential truth is not in doubt. A teenage girl who worked with cloth died in the rising, and the city has refused to forget her for more than 2 centuries. At the Monteleon artillery barracks, 2 Spanish army captains, Luis Daoiz and Pedro Velarde, disobeyed their standing orders to remain confined to quarters and opened the gates. They turned their cannons over to the crowd, and a handful of soldiers and a mob of civilians held the position for hours against overwhelming assault. Both officers died there. Their names today mark streets, statues, and a square in the city, remembered in a country that has argued bitterly about nearly everything else in its history except them. And among the French forces that day were the Mamelukes, cavalry recruited in Egypt, whose charge through the packed crowd at the Puerta del Sol is the exact scene Goya froze in the first of those 2 paintings. By afternoon, the rising was crushed. Murat declared that French blood demanded vengeance. And through that night and into the 3rd of May, firing squads worked on the hill of Principe Pio and at other sites around the city. Hundreds of Madrileños were executed, many of them taken almost at random. Labourers found with work knives in their pockets, men who had been nowhere near the fighting. The man in the white shirt in Goya's second painting kneels on that hill. Goya painted both canvases 6 years later, and art historians have written entire books about why the second one still feels so unbearably modern. Consider what is missing from it. There is no noble general on a rearing horse. There is no flag, no trumpet, no glory of any kind. There is a lantern on the ground, a line of soldiers with their backs to us and their faces hidden, and a human being with seconds left to live. His arms thrown open in a gesture that every viewer recognizes without being told. Goya gave the victim a face and the killers none. When you stand before that painting in the Prado, you are not looking at history. You are looking at a warning that has never expired. Napoleon assumed the executions would end the matter. Instead, the news of the 2nd of May detonated across Spain within days, town by town, province by province. Local juntas rose and declared resistance in the name of the deposed king. Spain became the war Napoleon could not finish. It was in these years that the world learned a new word: guerrilla. The little war, fought by armed civilians and flying columns against a conventional army that won nearly every pitched battle and still lost the country. The uprising became one of the sparks of a 6-year conflict that cost France and its allies enormous losses, with estimates varying widely depending on what is counted. Napoleon himself, in exile years later, is reported in memoirs to have blamed the Spanish ulcer for draining his empire. The wording is second-hand and the phrase may have been polished by others. The strategic judgment behind it is shared by most military historians. For Madrid itself, the war years were bitter beyond anything in the city's memory. Joseph Bonaparte ruled from the royal palace, and it is one of history's small ironies that he was not a monster. He abolished the Inquisition. He tore down crowded blocks to open public squares, earning the mocking nickname King of Little Plazas. He tried, genuinely, to be a reforming monarch. It did not matter in the slightest. He was the occupation, and Madrid starved under him. In the famine of 1811 and 1812, with the countryside stripped by armies and supply lines broken by the guerrillas, contemporary accounts describe carts collecting the dead from the streets each morning. Estimates cited by Spanish historians place the toll in the many thousands, possibly approaching 20,000, in a city of under 200,000 people. Goya lived through it. He recorded it in his print series, The Disasters of War. Images so unflinching that they were not published in full until decades after his death, when the men in them were safely beyond embarrassment. British and Portuguese armies under the Duke of Wellington, together with Spanish forces and the guerrillas, ground the French down, and in 1813 the occupation collapsed. Fernando VII returned to his throne in 1814, and here the story turns to ash in the mouth. The Spain that had bled for 6 years had also, in the besieged city of Cadiz in 1812, written one of the most advanced liberal constitutions of its age, a document that declared sovereignty to reside in the nation and promised citizens rather than subjects. Fernando, restored by the sacrifice of his people, repealed it almost immediately, restored absolute rule, and hunted down the very liberals who had fought to keep his crown on his head. Some were imprisoned, some were executed, many fled abroad, and Spanish exile politics began a career that would last a century and a half. The people of Madrid had risen for a king who came back as a jailer. Goya offered his 2 paintings to commemorate the rising. Then watched the country the rising had saved persecute its own heroes, and eventually left Spain himself to die in France. The man in the white shirt had won, and he had lost. Madrid would spend the entire next century trying to decide which. Chapter 9. A Century of Whiplash. In the year 1862, a 19-year-old law student from the Canary Islands stepped off the train into Madrid, skipped most of his classes, and spent his days doing something far more useful. He walked. He sat in cafes and listened. He rode the new horse trams, read every newspaper he could afford, and watched revolutions arrive and depart like weather. His name was Benito Pérez Galdós, and he is often ranked as the greatest Spanish novelist since Cervantes. filling dozens of books with the streets, voices, boarding houses, and quarrels of this city. Historians of Madrid still mine his pages the way archaeologists mine soil. So let him be our guide through the most chaotic century Madrid ever lived, because he saw most of it with his own eyes and wrote nearly all of it down. And what a century it was to watch. If the 1800s in Spain were a weather report, it would read as follows: absolutism, followed by revolution, followed by restoration, with scattered outbreaks of civil war and one brief republic before nightfall, depending on how the term is defined. Historians count dozens of coups and attempted coups across the century, so many that Spanish gave the world a word for the genre: pronunciamiento, the military pronouncement, in which a general reads a declaration and the country waits to see whether the army agrees. We are not going to march through every one of them, because a list is not a story. Watch two things instead. Watch the argument, one single argument that never ends. And watch the city, because while the politicians shouted, Madrid physically became the capital we recognize today. The argument was the one Fernando VII set up in 1814. What is Spain? Is it the old Spain of throne and altar, or the new Spain of the Cadiz Constitution? Citizens and laws. Every convulsion of the century is that question wearing a different uniform. When Fernando died in 1833, leaving only a small daughter, Isabel, his brother Carlos claimed the throne, and the old Spain rallied to him. The result was the First Carlist War. 7 years of civil war, with further Carlist risings flaring for decades afterward, mostly in the north but always aimed at Madrid, always about that same question. The historians Raymond Carr and Stanley Payne, whose surveys of modern Spain remain standard references, describe the century in similar terms: a country attempting to build a modern state on top of an unresolved quarrel about its own soul. Galdós arrived in time for the argument's loudest years. Queen Isabel II had grown up to preside over scandal and stagnation, and in 1868 a revolution called the Glorious drove her from the throne and out of Spain. The young writer watched the crowds from the sidewalks and later poured the whole era into his novels, including a vast cycle of historical fiction that walks the reader through the century year by year. What followed reads like a nation trying on costumes in front of a mirror. Spain imported an Italian prince, Amadeo of Savoy, as a constitutional king. He lasted barely 2 years, and on departing he is widely reported to have called Spaniards ungovernable, a remark that survives in several versions. So treat the exact wording as tradition. Then came the First Spanish Republic in 1873, which burned through 4 presidents in 11 months before a general's coup snuffed it out. The Bourbons returned yet again, this time in the person of Isabel's son, Alfonso XII, under a carefully engineered system in which 2 parties agreed to alternate in power, and elections were routinely managed from above. The argument was not settled. It was postponed, decade by decade, and every postponement raised the eventual price. That thought will wait for us in 1936. Now turn from the politicians to the city, because here the century was quietly triumphant, and Galdós recorded every stage of the transformation. In 1851, the first train steamed out of Madrid toward Aranjuez, and within a generation the rail network, built radiating from the capital like spokes from a hub, did for iron what Philip II had done for paper. It made Madrid the point through which Spain moved. A merchant in Valencia now shipped through Madrid. A student from Galicia arrived through Madrid, the appointed capital, which had no natural reason to be a crossroads, was made into one by engineering. In 1858 came the project that changed the city's destiny more than any coup ever did. The Canal de Isabel II brought the waters of the Lozoya River down from the Guadarrama Mountains through tunnels and aqueducts. And when the first great fountain jet rose in the street of San Bernardo before assembled crowds, people wept and threw their hats. Understand why. Madrid's ancient ceiling, the thirst of a dry plateau, had just been lifted. The town built on hidden wells finally had a river's worth of water delivered to it, and the canal still supplies the city under the same name today. Every high building, every new neighborhood, every hospital and public bath of the following century rests on that engineering decision. With water and rails came room to grow. In 1860, the government approved the ensanche, the Great Widening, a plan by the engineer Carlos Maria de Castro to wrap the old city in a rational grid of wide streets and uniform blocks. Walk the Salamanca district today, past its right-angled elegance and its stone balconies, and you are walking inside Castro's drawing. The financier who poured his fortune into building it, the Marquis of Salamanca, went spectacularly bankrupt doing so, and left his name on what became the most expensive neighborhood in Spain. Galdós, characteristically, cared less about the grand facades than about who could afford to live behind them, and his novels track the new middle class moving in floor by floor, with the poor climbing to the attics and the servants sleeping under the eaves. Horse trams appeared in 1871. Electric light followed in the 1880s. Madrid began the century around 200,000 people and ended it above 500,000. Then, at the very end of this century of noise, came the quietest and deepest wound of all. In 1898, Spain went to war with the United States over Cuba and lost in months. The fleet was destroyed at Santiago de Cuba and again at Manila. In the Treaty of Paris that followed, Spain relinquished sovereignty over Cuba and ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. In American memory, that war is a brisk footnote in the story of a rising power. For Spain, it was the end of the story the country had told itself since Columbus. The empire governed for 3 centuries from the desks of Madrid was finished, and the news reached the city not as a battle report, but as a kind of silence. The shock produced something remarkable. Not riots, writers, a loose circle of essayists, novelists, and Poots, remembered as the generation of '98. Unamuno, Baroya, Azorin, and Machado among them, sat in the cafes of Madrid and asked in print the question the politicians had spent a century avoiding. What is Spain, if not an empire? They walked the bare landscapes of Castile, reread Don Quixote as a national self-portrait, and argued that the country had to stop living on the memory of gold and find itself instead in its own soil, its own language, and its own people. It was a painful conversation, and it was the healthiest thing Spain had done in 100 years. The aging Galdós was their bridge and their elder, still writing, nearly blind now, dictating novels to a secretary, and still walking his city on the arm of a friend. He died in January of 1920. The newspapers reported enormous crowds following the coffin through the streets he had spent 60 years describing. Tens of thousands of ordinary Madrileños walking behind a novelist. The century of Whiplash was buried with its best witness, and the city he left behind was about to build its dazzling modern face. Chapter 10. Gran Via and the Roaring Madrid. Every great city has one street that announces what it wants to become. Paris cut it Boulevard. New York raised Broadway. And in April of 1910, King Alfonso XIII took a small silver pickaxe and struck a ceremonial blow against the wall of a priest's house near the church of San Jose, and Madrid began carving the Gran Via. Understand what this meant, because it was surgery, not decoration, to drive one straight avenue through the heart of the old city. Madrid demolished more than 300 buildings and erased or cut through dozens of older streets, some of them dating back to the age of Cervantes. Families were displaced, businesses vanished. Critics called it vandalism, and a popular satirical song mocked the project for years, joking that the avenue would never be finished, that Madrid would be digging forever. In a sense, the joke was accurate. The Gran Via was built in 3 separate stretches over almost 20 years, through a world war, a dictatorship, and the fall of a monarchy, and the last section only reached the Plaza de España in the 1920s. But what rose along it was Madrid's declaration that it intended to live in the 20th century. Steel-framed buildings in the American manner, the first the city had seen. The metropolis building on its corner site, crowned with a dome of gilded slate and a winged statue that became a postcard before the mortar was dry. The Telefonica building, finished around 1929, a slab of offices standing among the tallest buildings in Europe at the time. A tower full of telephones on a street where water carriers had walked within living memory, and along the avenue, one after another, the cinemas, palaces of 1,000 seats and more, with organs and ushers and marble lobbies, because Madrid fell in love with film early and completely. There were cocktail bars imitating New York, department stores imitating Paris, and neon signs imitating everybody. Travelers who knew both cities began calling the Gran Via the Broadway of Madrid, and the nickname stuck because it was earned. Beneath the new street, the city dug its second revolution. In October of 1919, Alfonso XIII rode the first train of the Madrid Metro, Line 1, 8 stations running from Sol North to Cuatro Caminos, a system shaped in significant part by the engineer Miguel Otamendi. Its arrival rewrote daily life more thoroughly than any avenue could. A labourer could now live in a cheap outer district and work in the centre, arriving dry in the rain and on time in the snow. Madrid was becoming a true mass city, and the census tells the story plainly. From around 500,000 people at the turn of the century, the population climbed toward the million mark by the early 1930s. But the reason this chapter matters to world history is not steel or subways. It is a student dormitory, on a small hill in the north of the city, on ground the students nicknamed the Hill of the Poplars, stood the Residencia de Estudiantes, founded in 1910 on the model of an Oxford college. The idea behind it was radical for Spain. Bring together young men from different disciplines, house them well, feed them decently, surround them with lectures and music and conversation, and let them educate one another between classes. In the early 1920s, its rooms held, at the same time, a poet from Granada named Federico Garcia Lorca, a painter from Catalonia named Salvador Dali, and a film-obsessed Aragonese named Luis Buñuel, a poet, a painter, and a filmmaker, 3 of the century's giants, walking the same corridors, playing pranks on one another, arguing about art until dawn, and forming friendships that would later break in spectacular fashion. Their letters and memoirs document it all, and biographers have been mining that dormitory for 100 years. Einstein lectured at the Residencia. So did Marie Curie. For one bright decade, A student residence in Madrid was one of the crossroads of European thought. Around them, the wider city was having its own conversation, and it happened in cafes. The tertulia is a fierce Spanish institution, a standing conversation that meets at the same table on the same nights for years, and Madrid ran on them. Writers, painters, journalists, and bullfighters held court in the cafes of the Gran Via and the old literary quarter. Ramon Gomez de la Serna presided for years at the Café Pombo over a gathering that treated absurdity as a serious artistic program. Newspapers multiplied and fought each other. Publishing houses printed cheap editions that put literature within reach of clerks and shop assistants. Women cut their hair, took jobs in offices, and entered universities in numbers their mothers would not have believed. The Madrid of the 1920s was remembered by many of the writers and artists who lived it as one of the most exhilarating capitals in Europe. And the remarkable thing is how many of them wrote that down independently. Now listen for the trouble underneath the jazz. Because it was there, and it was structural. The dazzling Madrid of the Gran Via was a thin crust. Behind the new facades, much of the city still lived in crowded tenements with shared water and no sunlight. Beyond the last metro, stops spread shanty settlements of migrants arriving from an impoverished countryside. Spain itself remained a country of enormous landed estates in the south, worked by landless labourers whose conditions had barely changed in a century, and of industrial cities in the north, where labour conflict was becoming routine and armed. The political system, that polite arrangement of two parties taking turns, had lost the ability to represent any of this. In 1923, the General Miguel Primo de Rivera seized power with the king's acceptance, promising to clean up the country. He ruled as dictator for 6 years of public works, concrete, and censorship, and for a while the economy hummed and the roads improved, but he never solved the underlying quarrel. And when he fell in 1930, he took the monarchy's last credibility down with him. Alfonso XIII had endorsed a dictatorship. That endorsement could not be unsigned. The end came with astonishing speed, and it came through ballot boxes rather than barricades. In April of 1931, Spain held municipal elections. In Madrid and nearly every other major city, Republican candidates swept the vote. Crowds filled the Puerta del Sol, the square above that first metro line, singing and waving the tricolour flag of a republic that did not yet officially exist. Alfonso XIII read the numbers and read the streets, understood that the army would not fire on this, and left the palace quietly for exile without formally abdicating. On the 14th of April, 1931, the Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed in the Puerta del Sol, to celebrations that witnesses described as the largest the city had ever seen. Think back to the argument that ran through the whole 19th century. Old Spain against New Spain. Throne against Constitution. In 1931, for the first time, that argument was going to be held with full democracy, full press freedom, and full participation. Everyone was finally in the room. The tragedy we now walk toward is that the room could not hold. Chapter 11. The City That Said No Pasarán. I want to begin this chapter carefully, because it is the most painful in Madrid's history, and in Spain it remains a living argument rather than a settled one. Where the facts are established, I will state them. Where numbers or blame are still debated by historians, I will say so plainly. That is the only honest way to tell it. The Second Republic was born in joy and lived in turbulence. In 5 years it attempted to reform everything at once: land, army, church, education, and labour, all in a country with little experience of compromise and a press that treated politics as war. Each reform raised hopes on one side and fears on the other faster than any government could manage. There were coup attempts from the right and revolutionary risings from the left. Political violence climbed in the streets, and paramilitary groups appeared on both flanks. In February of 1936, a left-wing coalition, the Popular Front, narrowly won national elections, and through that spring the temperature kept rising. Assassination answering assassination. In July, a group of generals launched a military uprising against the elected government. Among them, rising quickly to leadership, was Francisco Franco. The generals expected to seize the country in days. Instead, the rising succeeded in roughly 1/3 of Spain and failed in the rest, including Madrid and Barcelona, and the country fell into full civil war. Within months, that war stopped being only Spanish. Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy sent aircraft, tanks, and tens of thousands of men to Franco's side. The Soviet Union sold arms and sent advisors to the Republic, and its influence over Republican politics grew as the war went on. The democracies, Britain, France, and the United States, chose official non-intervention, a policy whose consequences historians still debate sharply. The war became, among other things, a testing ground for the weapons, tactics, and international alignments that the world would see again on a far larger scale within a few years. By late October of 1936, Franco's professional army of Africa had driven north to the edge of Madrid, and nearly every military observer in Europe expected the capital to fall within days. Foreign newspapers set their headlines in advance. The Republican government itself evacuated to Valencia, leaving a defense council behind. What happened instead is the reason this chapter exists. The city did not fall. Its defense was improvised out of everything Madrid had. Regular army units that had stayed loyal, hastily armed militias of workers from the very neighborhoods now under fire, women digging trench lines in the Casa de Campo Park, metro tunnels used to move troops beneath the front, buildings sandbagged at the ground floor while families still lived upstairs. Over the radio and in the streets, the communist deputy Dolores Ibarruri, known as La Pasionaria, gave the defense its voice with a phrase that travelled around the world. No Pasarán, they shall not pass. In the university district on the city's western edge, the front line ran literally through faculty buildings, and soldiers fought floor by floor through the School of Philosophy, barricading corridors with library books because that was what the room contained. The line stabilized there, inside a university, and it barely moved for the next 28 months. Into that battle came one of the most extraordinary migrations of the 20th century. Volunteers from more than 50 countries, most of them organized through the international brigades, made their way to Spain to fight for the Republic. Roughly 35,000 over the course of the war. By widely cited scholarly estimates, nearly 3,000 were Americans, and they named their unit the Abraham Lincoln Battalion. They were students, seamen, teachers, and the sons of immigrants from Brooklyn and Chicago and Ohio, most of whom had never held a rifle before they reached the Pyrenees. Roughly a quarter of them were killed. According to the accounting of the volunteers' own Veterans Association and later historians, whatever one concludes about the politics that organized the brigades, and historians document the deep communist role in their recruitment and command. The volunteers' motives and their courage under fire are attested across the sources. It remains one of the few times in history that thousands of Americans crossed an ocean against their own government's neutrality policy, to fight in someone else's war because of what they believed it stood for. Madrid under siege also became one of the most reported and photographed battlefields in the world. The correspondents worked out of the Hotel Florida on the Gran Via and filed their dispatches from the Telefonica building, the tallest tower in the city, which served as press office and artillery observation post at the same time and was itself shelled repeatedly. Ernest Hemingway came for months, and his dispatches, and later his novel For Whom the Bell Tolls, fixed the Spanish War in the American imagination for a generation. Martha Gellhorn reported from the same hotel. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry came. So did the photographer Robert Capa, whose images of this war helped invent modern war photography. The Gran Via itself earned a new nickname among Madrileños, Avenue of the Shells, because Franco's artillery on the hills west of the city could reach it, and did, almost daily. People learned which side of the street was safer and walked it out of habit for years afterward. And here a hard fact must be stated soberly. Madrid became one of the first major European capitals subjected to sustained aerial bombardment, including repeated attacks that struck residential neighborhoods and were intended in part to weaken civilian morale. German and Italian aircraft flying for Franco carried out those raids from 1936 onward, and historians including Anthony Beevor record that German forces also gained operational experience in Spain. Testing aircraft, coordination, and bombing methods that were used later across Europe. The strategy failed in its central purpose. Morale bent and did not break, and Madrid developed the grim routines that London would learn a few years later. The shelters, the sirens, the schools moved underground. But civilians died in numbers researchers are still refining, and the fear was constant for 2.5 years. When the northern town of Guernica was destroyed from the air in April of 1937, Pablo Picasso answered with the painting Guernica, which toured the world as the war's conscience and hangs today in Madrid. A few minutes' walk from a railway station, we will reach in the final chapter. Honesty also requires the darker ledger on both sides, and I am not going to soften it. In besieged Madrid in the autumn of 1936, amid panic about a fifth column inside the city, thousands of imprisoned supporters of the Rising were removed from jails and killed, most infamously in the mass executions at Paracuelos, a crime documented by historians across the political spectrum, with responsibility among Republican authorities still debated in its details. Churches were burned and clergy were killed in Republican territory in numbers that shocked Catholic Europe. In territory taken by Franco's forces, repression was systematic, organized, and continued long after victory, with executions that scholarly estimates place in the tens of thousands during and after the war. The poet of the Residencia de Estudiantes, Federico Garcia Lorca, was arrested and shot near Granada in the war's first weeks by forces of the Rising, and his grave has never been found. All of these facts belong in the same breath, because that is what the evidence demands. A civil war is not a story with clean hands. The end, when it came from exhaustion. Through 1938, the Republic's territory was cut in two, and its supplies dwindled as its remaining allies calculated the coming European war. The international brigades were withdrawn that autumn in a doomed diplomatic gesture, and the foreign volunteers marched a last parade through Barcelona while crowds wept, and La Pasionaria told them they were history and legend. In Madrid, in the war's final bitter twist, Republican factions fought each other in the streets in March of 1939 over whether to negotiate or resist to the end. On the 28th of March, 1939, Franco's army entered a city whose defense had collapsed from hunger, internal division, and the wider defeat of the Republic, rather than from any final storming of its lines. The war was declared over 8 days later. Count the cost, and count it carefully. By the estimates most commonly cited in modern scholarship, the war killed several 100,000 people in combat and repression combined, and drove roughly 500,000 into exile, among them scientists, teachers, doctors, and writers whose absence Spain would feel for 2 generations. Madrid ended the war starving and shattered, its university district a ruin, its people waiting to learn what defeat would mean, and the century-long argument about what Spain was had been answered in the worst way an argument can be answered, by silencing one side entirely. The lights of the Gran Via came back on. The most reported battlefield in Europe now disappeared into one of the quietest decades in its history. Not peaceful, quiet. There is a difference. Chapter 12. The Grey Decades. On the 1st of April, 1939, Franco's final war communique announced that the war had ended. What began in Madrid that day was not peace as most countries understand the word. It was victory, administered daily, for 36 years. The first decade was the hardest, and the Spaniards who lived it gave it a name that needs no translation. Los años del hambre, the years of hunger. The country was wrecked, its gold reserves spent, its fields untended, its transport broken. Then the Second World War closed Europe around it. Franco kept Spain officially out of that war, though he sent a division of volunteers to fight alongside Germany on the Russian front. And after 1945, the victorious democracies treated his government as an outcast. Spain was excluded from the United Nations in its early years and left out of the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Western Europe. Madrid in the 1940s was a capital of ration books, power cuts, and the black market, the estrépalo, which decided who ate and who did not. Historians of the period, including Paul Preston, describe malnutrition and disease claiming lives well into the late 1940s, with estimates of the excess deaths of the hunger years running into the hundreds of thousands nationwide, figures that researchers continue to refine. And hunger was only half the weight. The repression did not stop with the war. Military tribunals worked for years. Prisons and labour battalions held hundreds of thousands at their peak. And executions continued into the 1940s, with post-war totals placed by scholarly estimates in the tens of thousands. In Madrid, the wall of the Eastern Cemetery where thousands were shot is a memorial today. I state this plainly and briefly, not to dwell on it, but because the silence of these decades was not an atmosphere, it was enforced. Censorship reviewed every newspaper, every film, every song lyric. Teachers were purged. Books disappeared from libraries. The other half of the old argument had not been persuaded. It had been buried. And it waited. Franco also reached for stone. On a mountain ridge north of Madrid, over almost 20 years, rose the Valley of the Fallen, a basilica drilled into living rock beneath a granite cross, some 150 meters tall. Political prisoners were among the workforce through the regime's system of sentence reduction by labor, working alongside paid civilian workers. And historians continue to debate the scale and the conditions of that labor. Franco presented the monument as a memorial to all the war's dead. Most historians describe it as a monument to his victory. Modern Spain has argued about what to do with it for decades. which tells you that the burial of the argument did not take. Then, in the 1950s, the world turned. Washington stopped asking what Franco had been and started asking what Spain was worth. And the answer was geography, the crossroads guarding the Western Mediterranean. In 1953, the United States and Spain signed the Pact of Madrid, American money and recognition in exchange for military bases on Spanish soil. In 1955, Spain entered the United Nations. In 1959, President Eisenhower flew to Madrid and embraced Franco in front of the cameras, an image the regime used for years. The outcast was back in the room, not forgiven, but useful. What followed was the strangest turn of the grey decades. In 1959, a new team of technocrat ministers, many of them linked to the Catholic organization Opus Dei, persuaded Franco to abandon economic self-sufficiency. The stabilization plan opened Spain to trade, investment, and tourists. The result is known in economic history as the Spanish Miracle. Through the 1960s, Spain experienced one of the fastest sustained growth rates in the industrializing world, often compared with Japan's expansion in the same years. Sun-starved northern Europeans discovered the Spanish coasts by the millions. Arriving with cameras and leaving with currency, cars built under license in Barcelona put Spanish families on new highways for the first time, and Madrid swelled. This is the part of the story that explains the city you would visit today. And the best way to understand it is not through the totals, but through the shape of a single life. So let me offer you a composite, one that no archive records because it happened hundreds of thousands of times with different names. Imagine a couple in their 20s leaving a village in Extremadura or Andalusia around 1958. The village has no paved road and no work for young people, and the land belongs to someone else. They ride a slow train north with rope-tied suitcases. They would arrive at Atocha station, where a cousin who came the year before would be waiting on the platform, because that is how nearly all of it happened. One relative pulling the next. Their first Madrid home would not be an apartment. It would be a self-built shack of brick and salvaged sheet metal in a Chabola settlement on the southern or eastern edge of the city, with water from a shared tap and no drainage at all. He would find work on the construction sites that were rising everywhere, laying brick for the very apartment blocks he could not yet afford. She would clean apartments in the Salamanca district, in buildings her grandchildren would one day be unable to buy into. And if the overtime held and nothing went wrong, within a decade they would move into a small flat in a new working-class district like Vallecas or Carabanchel, 60 square meters of poured concrete, with running water, a bathroom, and an elevator that worked most days. After the shack, it would feel like a palace. There was no single family like that. There were hundreds of thousands of them, and their arrival is the largest event in the modern history of this city. Madrid's population roughly doubled across the 1950s and 60s, pushing past 3 million in the metropolitan area by the 1970s. The brick districts they built and filled, loud with accents from every poor province in Spain, are the true monuments of the era, more than any basilica in the mountains, and the children raised in those flats, the first generation of their families born in Madrid, would grow up to throw the loudest party in Europe. We will meet them in the next chapter. The regime aged with its founder. Its final years brought scattered strikes, student protests in the same university district where the trenches had run, priests who preached against the government, and violence. In December of 1973, the Basque group ETA assassinated Franco's prime minister, Luis Carrero Blanco, with a bomb buried under a Madrid street. A blast so powerful that it hurled his car over the roofline of a nearby building and into an interior courtyard. Carrero Blanco had been the man expected to hold the system together after Franco died. His death removed the plan. The question no one could say aloud filled every cafe in the city. What happens after? On the 20th of November, 1975, after a long final illness reported in medical bulletins that the whole country learned to decode, Francisco Franco died in a Madrid hospital bed. He had ruled for 36 years. 2 days later, a 37-year-old king he had personally groomed, Juan Carlos I, was proclaimed before the assembled loyalists of the regime. Nearly everyone, supporters and opponents alike, assumed the story would continue as written. Nearly everyone was wrong. Chapter 13. The Explosion of Joy. Here is a question from the end of the 20th century that political scientists still assign to their students. How does a 40-year dictatorship dismantle itself through negotiation and law? Despite street violence, attempted coups, and the entrenched interests of the regime itself, Spain's answer between 1975 and 1982 astonished the world, and Madrid was its stage. The new king had sworn loyalty to the regime's principles, and its hardliners expected him to preserve them. Instead, moving carefully and reading the room for months, Juan Carlos I chose as prime minister in 1976 a smooth young insider named Adolfo Suarez. Suarez had come up inside the system, ran its television service, and knew exactly which levers it had. Together they performed a feat of political judo. They used the dictatorship's own legal machinery to vote itself out of existence, the regime's own parliament, filled with men appointed by the old order, approved a political reform law that ended its monopoly, in a session that has been described ever since as a body voting for its own dissolution. The reform then passed a national referendum by an overwhelming margin. Political parties were legalized, including, in the most dangerous decision of the entire process, the Communist Party. Legalized over Easter weekend in 1977, while the army seethed. In June of 1977, Spain held its first free elections in 41 years, and Suarez won them. In 1978, a new constitution, drafted by consensus among parties that included the political heirs of both sides of the Civil War, passed by referendum. The transition rested on a deliberate and still debated choice: an amnesty law covering the crimes of the past, a mutual agreement to look forward rather than prosecute, which many at the time considered the necessary price of peace and which many Spaniards today regard as an unpaid debt. That argument is live, not settled, and it runs through Spanish politics to this day. The transition also had enemies with guns, and its most dangerous night played out on live radio. On the 23rd of February, 1981, as Parliament voted on a new Prime Minister, some 200 civil guards, led by Lieutenant Colonel Antonio Tejero, burst into the chamber, firing submachine guns into the ceiling, ordering deputies to the floor. In Valencia, tanks rolled into the streets. For hours, Spain sat around its radios in the dark, not knowing whether the previous 6 years had just been cancelled. Then, after 1 a.m, King Juan Carlos I appeared on national television in the uniform of Captain General of the Armed Forces and ordered the military to stand with the Constitution. The coup crumbled by midday. For many Spaniards, that televised intervention became the defining public moment in the defeat of the coup. though historians and journalists continue to debate parts of that night's hidden political history, and later controversies would complicate the king's own legacy considerably. What is beyond debate is the image the country kept from the chamber itself. 3 men who refused to dive for cover while the bullets flew. Suarez among them, sitting upright at their desks in a room full of people lying on the floor. Spain calls that night 23F, and remembers it as the night the democracy held. And while the politicians diffused 4 decades of history, the city around them detonated. It is called La Movida Madrilena, the Madrid scene. And it was what happened when the children of those migrant brick neighborhoods met the end of censorship with electric guitars. Picture a typical night in the early 1980s at a club like Rock Ola, which became the scene's unofficial parliament. This is not one particular evening from anyone's memoir. It is what dozens of them looked like, assembled from what participants and journalists described again and again. The air would be cigarette smoke and hairspray. On stage, a band playing songs that would have been unpublishable 5 years earlier. And nobody in the room quite believing they were allowed to be there. In the crowd, art students standing next to bank clerks, punks next to poets, kids from Vallecas and Carabanchel whose parents had arrived from Extremadura with rope-tied suitcases 20 years before, photographers working the room, someone handing out flyers for a midnight screening somewhere else, fashion invented on the spot out of thrift shops and defiance, and underneath all of it, the specific electricity of a generation discovering that nobody was going to stop them. The music was real, and it lasted. Bands such as Radio Futura, Nahapop, and Alaska y los Pegamoids made records that Spaniards still play. Mixing punk, new wave, and pop with a lyrical irreverence that would have earned their parents a police file. Magazines and comics printed what had been unprintable. Photographers like Oka Leal turned the city into a staged canvas of impossible colours. The scene had its galleries, its record shops, its radio programs, and its neighbourhoods. Above all, the streets around Malassana, named for the girl with the scissors from Chapter 8, which became the geographic heart of the whole thing. Its most famous graduate arrived by an unlikely road. Pedro Almodóvar came to Madrid from a village in La Mancha as a teenager, and for about a decade he worked an ordinary office job at the National Telephone Company, the very Telefonica whose tower we have watched through this story. He spent his own money on a small camera and shot short films that were screened in bars, clubs, and cultural centres around the city, where the audience talked back to the screen. In 1980, he released his first feature, and by the middle of the decade he was carrying the colours, the humour, and the sexual frankness of this world into international cinema. He is, by wide critical account, the most influential Spanish filmmaker since Buñuel, the dormitory ghost of Chapter 10. It is a straight line from a student residence in the 1920s to a telephone clerk with a camera in the 1970s, and both lines run through Madrid. 2 details tell you how strange and real this moment was. First, the mayor, Enrique Tierno Galvan, an elderly socialist professor once expelled from his university chair under Franco, governed Madrid through the Movida years and, far from policing the party, blessed it. At a concert he famously used the slang of the young in a phrase usually translated as rock out and stay sharp, words that are often rendered more provocatively than their context warrants, and that were beloved precisely because a white-haired professor of political theory said them into a microphone. When he died in 1986, the press of the day described the crowds at his funeral as the largest Madrid had seen in decades. Second, the calendar. In 1986, Spain joined the European Economic Community, today's European Union. Barely a decade separated the last executions of the dictatorship from membership in the club of European democracies. Countries usually take generations to make that journey. Spain made it inside a single youth. Now the honest shadows, because euphoria keeps a ledger too. The Movida's chemical fuel took a real toll, and the heroin wave of the 1980s devastated working-class neighborhoods across Spain. A public health disaster measured in thousands of young lives and in a generation of families who lost children. The terrorism of ETA continued through these same years, killing hundreds across the country, many of them in Madrid. And the funerals of murdered police officers and politicians ran alongside the concerts. Industrial restructuring threw workers onto the street even as the new Spain shone in magazines. The party and the pain shared the same postal codes. Still, step back to the balcony view, because the transformation remains astonishing. In 1992, 17 years after Franco died, the world came to Spain twice in a single summer, for the Olympic Games in Barcelona and the World's Fair in Sevilla. While Madrid held the title of European Capital of Culture, the grey decades were over. The capital built to rule an empire, having lost the empire, having survived the siege and the silence, had finally found a job worthy of it. Capital of a free country. The story has one more turn, and it is the hardest test the free city would face. It arrived on an ordinary Thursday, on 4 commuter trains, 3 days before an election. Chapter 14. The morning of March 11 and the city today. Every city in this story has one day it cannot forget. For modern Madrid, the date is the 11th of March, 2004. It was an ordinary Thursday in the middle of an election campaign, 3 days before Spaniards were due to vote, between about 7:30 and 7:40 in the morning. At the peak of the commuter rush, 10 bombs hidden in backpacks exploded aboard 4 crowded trains on the line, running into Atocha station, Madrid's great southern terminal, a short walk from the Prado and from the museum where Guernica hangs. 191 people were killed in the bombings, the toll established in the Spanish courts, and later commemorative counts reached 193, including a victim who died of her injuries afterward and the officer killed in the raid that followed. Around 2,000 people were injured. Look at who they were. Students on their way to class, cleaners and office workers starting early shifts, and a striking number of immigrants, new Madrileños from Latin America, Eastern Europe, and North Africa, riding the cheap trains in from the working towns south of the city. 17 nationalities died on those 4 trains. It was the deadliest terrorist attack ever carried out on Spanish soil, and the deadliest in Europe since the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie in 1988. The response of the city is why this chapter exists, and it came in layers. The first layer was immediate and physical. Madrileños ran toward the trains, not away from them. Residents of the trackside neighborhoods climbed down to the rails with blankets and ladders and carried people up. Taxi drivers turned their cars into ambulances and drove the wounded to hospitals for free. Hour after hour, hospitals were so flooded with volunteers that blood donation lines stretched around blocks, and people had to be thanked and asked to come back the following days. By the account of the official reviews that followed, it was the ordinary population that carried much of the first hour, before any system could possibly have been in place. The second layer came the next evening. By government estimates reported in the press of those days, Somewhere around 2 million people filled the streets of Madrid in the rain, in what is commonly described as the largest demonstration in the city's history, with millions more marching in cities across Spain. Set that number beside the others this story has given us. A few thousand rebels against Napoleon's cavalry, hundreds of thousands defending the trenches in 1936, now 2 million, carrying no weapon of any kind, walking in the rain behind the families of the dead. The third layer was harder, because grief arrived tangled with politics. The bombings fell 3 days before a general election, and the question of who had done it. The Basque group ETA, as the government first insisted, or jihadist terrorists, as the evidence quickly indicated, became a national storm that filled those 3 days and poisoned the morning. The judicial investigation and the trial established that the attack was carried out by a jihadist cell inspired by Al-Qaeda. And in 2007, the Spanish courts convicted a group of perpetrators. The election saw the governing party voted out, and political scientists still debate how much the bombings and the handling of those 3 days moved the result. That debate is genuinely unresolved, and I will not pretend otherwise. 3 weeks after the attack, 7 of its principal authors blew themselves up in an apartment in the suburb of Leganés as police closed in, killing a special forces officer whose name now stands on the memorials beside the passengers he never met. What Madrid built afterward, and then built again, tells you what the city decided to become. For 16 years, a glass cylinder 11 meters tall stood outside Atocha station. Inside it, printed on a transparent membrane held up by air pressure, were messages of condolence left by ordinary citizens in the days after the attack, in dozens of languages, lit from above by the sky and from below at night. Then the city changed around it, as this city always does. The cylinder was dismantled in 2024 to allow the expansion of a metro line, and on the 20th anniversary of the attacks, a new memorial space opened inside the station itself, 4 times the size of the first. Its walls, painted a deep cobalt blue chosen by the victims' associations, carry the names of all those who died, along with words of remembrance preserved from the old monument. On its ceiling shine 193 points of light, one for each life. In March of 2026, a black stone pedestal and a permanent light were added beside it, so that flowers and wreaths can be laid there throughout the year rather than only on anniversaries. Consider what that memorial is not. It is not a sword. It is not an eagle. It is not a wall listing enemies. It is a blue room full of light and the words of strangers in a working railway station, where 100,000 people a day walk past on their way to work. The city that Goya painted kneeling before a firing squad chose, 2 centuries later, to remember its dead by keeping them inside daily life rather than setting them apart from it. And then Madrid did the most characteristic thing in this entire story. It kept going, and it grew. The 2 decades since have brought trials of the ordinary kind. A brutal financial crisis after 2008 that sent youth unemployment soaring and filled the squares in 2011 with the peaceful encampments of the indignados. A protest movement whose echoes reached Occupy Wall Street a few months later. A pandemic in 2020 that struck Madrid as hard as almost any city in Europe, emptying the Gran Via so completely that photographs from those weeks look like renderings. Each time, the pattern held. Argument in the plazas, stubbornness in the neighborhoods, recovery on the long curve. Look at the city today, in 2026, and measure it against everything we have seen. By several commonly used metropolitan definitions, Madrid is now the second largest urban area in the European Union after Paris, holding close to 7 million people, and it has become one of Europe's largest urban economies. The dry plateau town, with no port and no navigable river, sits at the centre of Spain's high-speed rail network, the largest in Europe and the second largest in the world after China's, with lines radiating from the capital exactly as the couriers of Philip II once did. But statistics are not the measure that matters most here. Walk the streets instead. The empire is gone so completely that you must visit a museum to touch it. And yet the empire's children are everywhere, because Madrid has become one of the great capitals of the Spanish-speaking world in reverse. Hundreds of thousands of Latin Americans, whose ancestors were governed from these streets by men reading reports at desks, now own shops here, run hospital wards here, teach in schools here, and raise madrileños here. Their morning trains pass through Atocha, beneath 193 points of light that burn for a morning when so many of the dead were immigrants like them. History does not often offer redemption. It sometimes offers this: a strange, imperfect, living reciprocity. The fortress that was built to watch for enemies now watches nothing. The watching is done. Around the old bluff where Mohammed I posted his garrison 11.5 centuries ago, the city spreads in every direction, glowing at night like spilled embers. Still arguing, still stubborn, still open. One question remains, the one we asked at the very beginning. What does a city built from almost nothing finally stand on? Walk with me one last time to the centre, because the answer is under our feet.